Hello from Blue Willow Bookshop in Houston, Texas. My name is Kathy Berner, and I'm the event coordinator at the store. We are so excited to host this virtual event with Eric Berger celebrating his new book, Reentry, SpaceX, Elon Musk, and the reusable rockets that launched a second space age. I am very eager to have this conversation with Eric tonight, so please join me in welcoming him to the screen. How
Good
are
evening.
you?
I'm great. Hi, Kathy. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too. We've got, I'll let you know when we need to give your hand a workout again. So, and that reference, friends, is because so many of you were so supportive and bought Eric's book Reentry, and we had to place a second massive order, and he's going to come in again and sign some more. I can't let this start without saying thank you to you and Matt and everyone at Space City Weather and at the eye wall, especially given that Helene is coming ashore tonight, and our hearts are just with everyone in Florida and the Southeast.
It's going to be an awful storm for people who are in the Houston area who remember Ike. One of the devastating things about Ike is it was so large it produced a massive storm surge. And that's exactly, I think, what we're going to see again with this storm. Only the effects from Helene are going to extend very far inland, well into Georgia, and I expect catastrophic flooding and even as far north as western North Carolina. It's going to be really, really a bad,
Yeah,
unfortunate event.
it is. And it's so stunning because when we talked over the weekend when you were signing books, we were kind of like, okay, well, something's coming. And it
That's how it
came so
goes with
fast.
that's how it goes with tropical weather. Yeah, there was definitely the potential for that to happen. Unfortunately, the worst did happen.
Yeah. Well, I, as a, as a Northerner who's now lived here for more than 20 years, am so grateful to you and to the entire team for providing us with such thoughtful and reasoned reporting. So thank you very much for that. So you started as a meteorologist, right?
I started as a science writer,
Okay,
and did that at the Houston Chronicle for a long time, for about 15 years. And I got interested in writing about hurricanes way back in 2005 with Katrina and Rita and Wilma, these major Category 5 hurricanes.
right.
And then I got really interested in space a few years later, particularly, toward the end of the space shuttle program and trying to think about what came next, where NASA was going. And that was really when the private space industry was really starting to rise. And so, SpaceX was clearly the dominant player in that industry. And it's just been fascinating to follow all along.
Yeah. So like what is there a specific thing? I know you just said as the space shuttle program was ending, but was there a specific incident or moment or reporting that really captured your interest and led to this path?
Yeah, in 2014, I did a long series called Adrift for the Chronicle, where basically spent most of the year looking at the existing space program and trying to figure out why we hadn't been back to the moon in at that time, 45 years, and where we were headed. And I titled it Adrift, so that kind of gives you some sense of where where my head ended up
Yeah.
with that program. But it did seem like one of the great hopes at that time was commercial space, and I got really excited about sort of the partnership NASA had formed with some of these companies to help it go back to the moon and beyond.
So as someone without much background in space, I mean, I'm a school
Hmm.
librarian turned bookseller. I always, the idea of commercial space just has always made me antsy for some reason. And over the past week, I've kind of been self interrogating why that is. And I think maybe it's because I've always thought, oh, the government knows what it's doing, but maybe it doesn't or doesn't have the resources. And these companies have that available now.
The thing is, there are some things that companies just do much more efficiently than the government. We've seen that in many industries, and what the really big transformation over the last 10 years has been in the launch industry.
Yeah.
So, we look back at the moon mission, the Apollo program, the big Saturn V vehicle, that was a government rocket. The space shuttle was a government rocket. It seemed like that's the way America was always going to get its astronauts into space. Well, it turns out that private companies can build rockets for about a tenth of the cost that NASA can. And it can build rockets that are just as good, if not better. Um, and it turns out that whereas the government was moving away from an architecture that was reusable, private companies were deciding, no, no, we need to really push and invest in technologies to reuse rockets. And the big difference, Kathy, is that the government's mandate when they explore space is to send small sorties. So we're talking about, during the moon, they sent three astronauts to the moon, two went down on the surface in Apollo. Artemis, they're sending four astronauts to the moon, two go down on the surface. Um, that's fine. And if the government does missions to Mars, it might be six astronauts. And and
Yeah.
and I don't think the government is going to do missions to Mars. But
Okay.
that being aside, so the question is, do we want to have a exploration program where it's a privileged few astronauts, and they're obviously the best and the brightest, or do we want to really make human a spacefaring species? And it's really the private companies that are driving the kinds of technologies we'll need for people to live, work in space, and not just a handful of government astronauts, but dozens and hundreds and thousands of people.
I got to write that down. Make humans a spacefaring species.
I mean, that's
That's a
Star
great
Trek,
line.
right? That's the future we
Right.
kind of all grew up with and we like to see. And the reality is, if you looked at where NASA was 20 years ago, and that's frankly what Elon Musk did and what Jeff Bezos did, that's not where the government was taking us. Um, and that wasn't the government's mandate, but that's where a lot of space nerds and space cadets wanted to go. And so they started companies to see if we could get there.
Yeah. It's just it's such an for someone who, I'm in my late 50s, I grew up with this. My biggest and maybe this is why, my biggest space the most impactful space moment was Challenger.
Mm-hmm,
Because
hmm.
one of my dear friends in high school was one of Krista McAuliffe's students.
Wow.
So that's how I look at it. Like I look at it as more of a risk with reward and adventure. And I'm guessing that more of these people and the space cadets and everything think of the adventure and the exploration with the acknowledged risk, but maybe that not weighing as much in their mind.
Yeah, it's more about why are we sending people into space? And the
Yeah,
government is sending people to space to explore, but they're also sending them for geopolitical reasons, right? We went to the moon during Apollo to beat the Soviet Union.
right.
China is investing a lot in their spaceflight program today for geopolitical interest to put themselves on par with the United States. We're
Yeah,
kind of in a competition with them to put humans on the surface of the moon at the South Pole. So there's strategic reasons why governments do this. If we're really going to settle the solar system, there has to be some kind of commercial imperative to do that. So there has to be a reason for humans to go to the moon. There has to be, some kind of ability to make money ultimately to pay for all of this. And so that's again, that's kind of the difference between commercial space. The commercial is like there's private money to be spent and made from this, and understandably, that does make some people very uncomfortable. They look at outer space and they say, why should humans be up there messing around with this pristine environment? But on the other hand, there's the human tendency to explore over that next hill, and this is really Star Trek said it's the final frontier.
yeah. I really like the reframing that you've just given me, and that seriously is very helpful. So thank you. I'm going to turn to some questions from our audience, and then if I have others, I'm just going to ask you. But here's one from Peter. Given SpaceX's rapid pace of innovation and their willingness to take risks, what do you think is the biggest internal challenge the company will face as they transition from their current phase of development to long-term sustainability in human space exploration and Mars colonization?
So that's a great question, and that's something that was in the back of my mind the entire time I was working on Reentry. As a matter of fact, it's the question that I framed the epilogue of the book about around was basically, look, because of this amazing decade or decade and a half of activity where you have Falcon 9, Dragon, Falcon Heavy, and now they're building the Starship vehicle, like SpaceX has leaped ahead of all the other spaceflight actors in the world, including NASA, including China. They're launching this year, they're going to launch 96% of the mass into orbit. Like 4% of that's or excuse me, 94%. 4%, other 4% is China, and the rest of the world's like 1 to 2%. So it's not even close today, right? So what and so a French rocket scientist about a decade ago sort of said the steamroller is on the horizon, and so you're talking about SpaceX, and now the steamroller is here. And so what could take the steamroller, derail the steamroller? And I think the answer really is Elon Musk, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, like he still is essential to the Mars vision and pushing the company forward. That is why he founded SpaceX, and he is pushing that company forward every day toward that goal. And they're making investments in Starlink and Starship to bring that about. And what you find is one of the almost unique things about SpaceX. I don't like the word unique, but really, when you have a lot of startup companies, like they have a founder's mentality where they're super disruptive. They come into the industry, they disrupt things, and then they kind of become the big they kind of become the established industry, and then
Mhm.
they kind of slow down. They get boards of directors, they grow, they have shareholders and everything. Boeing was once a very dynamic upstart company, and now they're not, right? And you look back throughout history, and there's many examples of this. Well, SpaceX miraculously, after 22 years, 21 years, 22 years, is still the disruptive startup company mindset. And that's because of Elon. There's no question about it. So he's got to remain, I like to say, he's got to remain disruptive, but he can't be distractive. And I think there's a segment of our country who's cheering him on with his political activity, but there's a lot of people who are really turned off by it. Um, and his overt political activity, his dabbling in conspiracy theory mongering, alienates a lot of people. Um, and we haven't seen that impact SpaceX too much, but I definitely think there's a future in which those behaviors become so distractive that it does really significantly start to harm SpaceX. So I think Elon is the sort of the greatest threat to the future of SpaceX, both if he were to become disengaged from the company, if they were to lose him for some reason, but also if he sort of continues this very political behavior that is alienating broad swaths of not just the United States, but SpaceX does a lot of work for Europe, and just making international partners wary of working with the company.
Yeah, thank you. Here is one from Jay. What payloads have been discussed for the first Mars landers?
Boy, that's ways off. I don't know if there's any formal payloads that have been. Well, I don't know the answer to that. I will say that there has been a group of scientists outside of NASA working with the agency to try to prepare the space agency for the potential for Starship and to start thinking about what you could send to Mars, including some pretty prominent scientists. And the idea there is simple, right? The heaviest thing we've ever landed on Mars are the two rovers, Curiosity and Perseverance, and those reach on the order of 1 ton. And Starship, landing on Mars could bring 100 tons. So you're just talking about an enormous volume of payloads that you could bring to the surface of Mars compared to anything that's come before. Um, I think, the initial missions to Mars are just going to be demonstrations. I can't imagine that they're going to have much in them in this terms of scientific payloads. I don't, but I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Um, this from Charles. If you have a son who is a budding space engineer, would you recommend that he work now and then study at MIT, or study at MIT now and work later?
Um, you probably want to get an undergraduate degree from MIT. But then, if your goal is to, build rockets or sort of get your hands dirty in space flight, as opposed to sitting behind a desk and in meetings all day, I mean, go get the industry experience. Working in a company like SpaceX or Blue Origin for 3 or 4 years is going to, no offense to academic institutions, but is going to give a much deeper um, uh, experience. And then from there, it will be much easier to find a second job as opposed to just coming out of graduate school.
Yeah, I think that's really wise advice too. Um, Here's one from Niraj. In regards to giving launch licenses, especially for Starship tests, based on what's happening with the FAA, is there any indication that there will be some fundamental changes within the FAA that will be coming, or is this just wishful thinking and business will continue as usual?
So that's a good question. I don't have all the answers. I think one of the reasons Elon has been politically engaged is that if he believes that if Trump is elected, they will scour away the regulations or the power of organizations like the FAA to be as heavy-handed, or to in SpaceX's mind, they're
Okay.
being heavy-handed on regulation. So I think that he sees that as an option. I think if Democrats were to win, it would sort of more or less continue as normal. The real question in my mind is, you know, for a long time, I believe that the FAA was just kind of it may have older policies and wasn't as nimble, but it was operating on pretty good faith. And I think it still is, but certainly some of the decisions we've seen taken with regard to Starship in South Texas is an agency that is not moving as quickly as SpaceX would like to see, probably not as quickly as NASA would like to see, because ultimately this is holding up the Artemis program to go back to the moon. So it's going to be really interesting, to see what happens if, you know, Elon is not doing himself any favors if if Kamala Harris wins the election, because she's not going to be incentivized to reform the FAA, even if it, may need it. And frankly, from the outside, it's really hard to know. I think the two things can be true, right? On one hand, SpaceX ought to follow the rules of the road. On the other hand, the rules of the road are probably Byzantine, not really written for a company that's as dynamic and as fast moving as SpaceX, and the FAA doesn't have the resources to implement those rules in a timely manner. So it's messy. Um, yeah.
Okay. Um, this is from Takai, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name. I've always been inspired by your journey and would love to follow in your footsteps to become a space writer. What would you recommend as the best ways to stay up to date with the latest news and developments in the space industry to bring ordinary people up to date and make them excited about space? Any tips or resources would be greatly appreciated.
Um, it's hard, right? Because it's the media landscape is really changing dramatically. When I came into the industry 25 years ago, the best job for covering news, if you were a writer, was to work for a newspaper. And that's really changed a lot. A lot of more online publications today, podcasts, video podcasts, YouTube videos, lots of different ways to reach people and monetize your content. I think, the most important thing is to really make sure you understand it. And honestly, the pathway I've found to success for, really kind of making a name for myself in the space industry was to really understand the subject matter that I was writing about, and then writing about it in a very thoughtful way. Not rewriting press releases, not, not playing favorites, but really to try to understand what's happening out there, either on the government side, the space policy side, in the private industry, and explaining that in thoughtful ways to people, and just trying to really say what's going on. And whether you do that in written form for a magazine, or for, a website, or in an audio form or podcast or video form, you've got to kind of decide what your medium of choice is. And then you've got to figure out a way to to reach your audience on social media, or however, you know your strengths better than I do. But my advice really would be to just make sure the content you're making is thoughtful and informing, and not just sort of repeating what everyone else is saying in the industry.
That's really good advice, I think, for anything that you're trying to, when you're trying to engage people, is to have, I mean, when I read your work, whether it's space or whether it's weather, um, I hear, I hear your sensibility, and
Yeah.
one of the reasons I enjoy it so much is because I appreciate your sensibility. So I think that's really, really good advice for aspiring writers. On the note of that, what does a day in your life look like when you're balancing both?
Right. So it depends. Like in Houston, we have lots of days where the weather is very hot and sunny, and so the it's you can get up at 6 a.m. in the morning and write a forecast and be done by 7 and move on with the rest of your day space wise. There are other days where there's a hurricane bearing down on the Texas coast, and it's basically 20 hours a day of looking and writing and about weather and talking to people about weather and trying to make sure that you're getting the best possible information out there. It just depends on it. The space news ebbs and flows, and the weather demands ebb and flow, and hopefully they don't, you know, flow at both the same time
Right, right,
because then
right.
it becomes very difficult. Fortunately, on the weather side, I work with a partner in Matt Lanza, and at Ars Technica, I have a colleague, Stephen Clark, who I can kind of lean on when I need to do local weather more. But
Yeah,
it
yeah.
just it's just really responsive to whatever kind of is the biggest alligator near the canoe, if you will.
And how do you decide when you're working on Ars Technica? Like,
Mhm.
I imagine there's not just one alligator. So how do you decide what alligator you're going to look at for a while? Because there's
Right,
so many
yeah.
different things going on.
So it's a combination of like how newsy is it? Like, has it been written about 10 times before?
Mhm.
Or is this something that no one else has really written about or explained? Is it something I find really interesting?
Okay.
Is it new or novel to me? Then I think it's new or novel to other people. And then, like, how important is it, right? Like, I don't want to write a story to help a company's bottom line, right, or their stock price or whatever. That's not, I'm not here to be the
Right.
marketing arm of any company or space agency. I'm really want to find out what the most impactful or meaningful things that are happening, and write about them. And then sometimes there's things that are just kind of crazy that's happening, and it may not be like the most important news, but everyone will kind of look at that and think either that's really funny or sad or whatever, and then you'll write about that. But it's mostly like I just go on instinct. Like what do I think is kind of the most interesting thing happening today that a
Yeah.
lot of people probably haven't heard about?
Well, for example, from your tweet 2 hours ago about the Russian PRK
Hmm.
module.
Yeah. Right. So yeah, that was like about 3 months ago I got a tip that not only was that leaking, which we'd heard about, but um like NASA has this 5 by 5 risk matrix that they go and you sort of go from 1 to 5 and it's high risk, low risk, and then low consequence, high consequence. And so if you've got a 5 by 5, it means you've got the highest level of risk and highest level of consequence. And so I found that this one small module, Russian part of the International Space Station, the leak now was classified as a 5 by 5, so high consequence, high risk. And like no one else had reported it, so I reported it, and then 3 months later, a government report comes out. And NASA, of course, wouldn't confirm it when I reported it. And so I had a couple of sources I felt confident in. And so a government report came out today that said, oh yeah, that was this leak is now that risk. So that's it's nice to have that kind of validation.
I can imagine, but also like again, total space novice. That's horrifying.
It is horrifying. There are ways you can mitigate it. Like
Right.
the risk is they're losing a few pounds of air a day, roughly, um, which is not nothing, but it's a pretty big space station, and then they can close off the hatch to that
Right.
module. But it is a sign that the space station that's been up there for more than 25 years is aging and does have a finite lifetime. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Here's a question from someone who is using their name in Roman numerals, and can't
Come on, do it. Let's see it. We'll do the
I
number.
can't translate it. It's MDCCCLV.
Uh, I'd plug that one in Google
Yeah, I
if
would
I had
too.
time.
Hang on. MDCCCLV is. Come on, tell me what it is. Don't just tell me how to write it.
1355. No, wait.
1855.
1855.
Okay, so now I got to figure out that significance. So thank you, person. You have given me something fun to look for. Okay, anyway, 1855 says Given the way that SpaceX operates, they have shown a willingness to move forward quickly. For steel, this means using a hardware rich approach and building multiple models. But for people, this means skirting normal safety standards and accepting high amounts of avoidable workplace injuries. Is this worth moving forward faster?
So the question I think is getting at the fundamental tension in SpaceX's approach, right? Where they are seeking to move as fast as possible, and in doing so, they're um they're bending and sometimes breaking regulations on workplace environments, things like that. And so there's a report, I believe it was Reuters a few months ago, that showed that the workplace injury rate at SpaceX was higher than in the industry. But my sense is that a lot of the companies that SpaceX was being compared to had comparatively higher numbers of employees at desk jobs versus in the factory or working on a launch site or in construction or hardware, where in those kinds of construction jobs you would tend to have more industry. So it's not entirely clear cut to me that SpaceX has a higher work rate. It is quite clear that its people work longer hours, um, and they are willing to take some risks. And so I think if you're fatigued, you are certainly more prone to injuries and risks. But, it's not like this company is out there, building World Cup facilities in the Middle East with
Yeah,
slaves from India where they're killing people. It's like the people working there are engineers and technicians who very much want those jobs and are working those long hours because they believe in the mission. And if they thought it was unsafe, they could leave. And so I think some of that stuff gets overblown, and it's really hard to argue with the fact that after 22 years, people still are clamoring to work at SpaceX, and it's a work environment that is far more productive than any other U.S. spaceflight company, or certainly the space agency. So, I mean, there's a price to progress, right? And I don't believe the price that people who work at SpaceX is are paying is too high. It's certainly a demanding environment. Some people burn out very quickly, and they leave, and some of them I think are scarred probably by that experience, but that certainly is not unique to SpaceX.
yeah. Um, Here is one from Ethan. Liftoff, Reentry. Is there another book on the way?
Not right away. After writing Liftoff, I knew that I wanted to write a book about the Falcon 9 era because that era was maturing, and it was pretty clear the effect that the Falcon 9 was going to have on spaceflight reusability and humans going into space. Um, I would like to explore the Starship era for SpaceX, but we're really at the beginning of that era rather than kind of in the middle or toward the end. Like, I have lots of questions about where this is all going to end up. Like, how long is it going to be before people actually launch in Starship? I think it's going to be a long time. How long before the first uncrewed starships land on Mars? Is Starship going to be suitable for NASA's Artemis program? How quickly will it be fully reusable? All of these are very important questions, and I think that any meaningful book about the Starship era needs to wait. So I've got a couple other projects I'm working on the interim. I don't really want to talk about them right now, but it's safe to say there's probably not another book for me coming out in the next 2 or 3 years.
It'll give your hand time to rest.
Yeah, my brain a break too.
I bet. Um, Here's one from Cameron. If you could talk with younger you when you started Liftoff, what advice would you give yourself?
Um, that's an interesting question. I guess I would just tell myself to really go for it and to realize that you're only going to get one shot to write the book about the origins of SpaceX and to be confident. Because when I first started Liftoff, I hadn't written a book before, wasn't sure, how to do it, and fortunately I had great editors. who really helped me with that process and to craft a narrative. But I probably would be just to be a little bit more confident in my approach and to realize that A, you're going to be able to do this and B, just kind of enjoy it because it was a thoroughly enjoyable experience. When I started writing the book, I didn't know very much about, the first 6 years of SpaceX and those launches and basically everything that those guys and gals went through.
Mhm.
And so I would probably just say enjoy the process. Don't stress so much.
That is excellent advice all around. Here is one from Peter. Given SpaceX's growing role in providing key capabilities for both NASA and the US military, how do you foresee Starship fitting into future defense and national security missions?
Well, it's really interesting because the military is starting to come around to the idea that this is a amazing new capability that they can use that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And so the initial way that they've done this is through a called a rocket cargo program, where they've put out a generic funding basically opportunity for companies that can launch cargo from the United States and have it land anywhere around the world.
Mhm.
Now, no company has landed a rocket vertically except for SpaceX. Um, so they're the only company that realistically could pull this off. And with Starship, you have such a large payload capacity, you could send a meaningful amount of supplies, medical supplies, weapons, to supplement a logistics breakdown or a supply line breakdown. And so that's one way, like literally you could load the cargo and it would be anywhere in the world in less than 24 hours. Actually within hours once it's loaded. So that they're interested in that capability.
Wow.
And I think also ultimately when it's operational in a few years, Starship is going to offer the capability to put an enormous amount of stuff in space, much, much larger payloads than the government currently launches. And I think from a spy satellite capability or government communications capability, there's going to be lots of opportunities there. The fact of the matter is the government has already seen the enormous value in the Starlink constellation. This is the low Earth orbit um, direct or low Earth orbit satellite internet constellation where they have 7,000 satellites and growing up there.
Mhm.
And this has proved to be an enormously valuable capability, and other countries, governments in Europe and China and elsewhere around the world are scrambling to try to build similar capabilities.
Okay. Here is a follow-up question to Takai's question about space exploration journalism. Justin asks, do you think that bias in space exploration journalism is a problem? If so, has the rise of commercial spaceflight made it more of a concern?
Not sure what the person means by bias. If they want to ask the question again, I will say that there's been a couple of big changes I've seen in journalism. When I got started, the job was pretty straightforward. You took the information that NASA provided about its missions and you wrote about it, and that was really
Yeah.
mostly the whole ball game. Um, and then you had a couple of different trends. One was the rise of commercial space. One was space companies going public through the special purpose acquisition companies or SPAC process. And so as a space journalist, you had to start to become more of an economic journalist as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and then obviously the whole move online has created many new opportunities for other people, content creators, to get in the industry and tell stories about spaceflight. Um, but if the person wants to clarify the question on
Yeah,
bias,
Justin, if you want to redo it, I'll follow up on it while I ask Eric another question. Here's one from Jay. Do you have any thoughts on the Cards Against Humanity trespassing lawsuit against SpaceX that was just filed?
um, I think that that's a clever way for Cards Against Humanity to market its product.
Okay. Here's one from Charles. Comparing Elon Musk with Steve Jobs, what do you think makes them so innovative?
I didn't know Steve Jobs at all, but I would say what makes Elon so innovative is he the thing that he does that's different is, I'll look at a problem in the world like climate change or the fact that humans haven't been back to the moon in 50 years and think, man, that really sucks. Um, it's kind of a bummer that, we can't fix that, like that NASA's not doing that or, NOAA's not fixing that or whatever. And Elon's like, has historically has been, that's a problem. Let's go fix it. And really thrown in, all of his resources and efforts to fix it. And he is really good at challenging his teams to look at old problems and try to find new ways to solve them, to not have preconceived notions, like that's the way it's always been done before. And so we've got to keep doing it that way. No, no, he'll look at a problem. He'll tell his team to look at a problem from first principles, and try to figure out, like if you've got to jump over a 50-foot wall, how big of a pogo stick do you need? Or, what it's just like it, it it's looking at old problems and trying to solve them in new ways. And then once you figure out a solution or have an idea to kind of push that all the way and not give up. And that was really one of the lessons from reusable rockets. Um, he was far from the first person to suggest that or have that as an idea. NASA tried it with the space shuttle for 30 years, and it was ultimately not cost effective. Department of Defense tried it. Lockheed tried it. Government, other contractors tried it, and like no one ever did it. And like they just kept trying and doing different ways and ultimately succeeded, in that. And so that, he didn't give up, which was super important.
Yeah. Justin has, we have two Justins, but this Justin has offered a clarification, the original Justin. The angle I was coming from was that commercial spaceflight seems to have more marketing, more PR, more corporate
Mhm.
personality behind it. And
Yeah.
so there's a different sort of fan base around it from what he grew up with, like NASA. I didn't know if you felt that there were negative effects from all of that on the quality slash integrity of the journalism.
Yeah, my lights just went out there, so sorry about that. I'm not sure what the problem is. Um, I think so. I think traditionally journalism has been really deferential to NASA. Um, and the big change, or one of the big changes, is that, and certainly I think I have been part of this, is to be a little more critical of what NASA's doing and to be willing to say, hey, what they're doing is not working and explain why. And to kind of not advocate for, but just kind of explain to people what's holding NASA back, what's holding humans back from going out there and doing things, and just trying to be really honest with people about that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Here is one from Megan. How do you think the Artemis moon landings will turn out? Will HLS Starship or any other lunar landers be ready on time?
No, um, they won't, but NASA made a bold decision in April of 2021, when they picked Starship. It was really the only lander they could afford, and they were betting on one company that had delivered for them. Like just a year before, SpaceX had put humans back into orbit on Dragon, and so it was the one company they knew that could really execute. But it was obviously Starship is a super complex system, and it's much larger than NASA really needs to get astronauts down on the moon. So it's going to take a while to get there. Um, you know, 2026 hasn't been a realistic date for a long, long time. Um, and I'm not sure 2028 is even a realistic date for the first lunar landing on Starship, but it's going to depend on how quickly NASA can get going. I would think I would urge people, the really important test that's coming up next is going to be an in-flight refueling test. And this is basically going to be involve the launch of a tanker Starship with propellant to low Earth orbit, and then pretty quickly thereafter a second Starship, and they're going to basically dock in low Earth orbit, and one vehicle is going to transfer a lot of propellant to the other vehicle. And this is something that's never happened before, and especially with these, and Starship is these are massive vehicles as well. You know, NASA is saying that that test has to happen in the first quarter of 2025 to remain on schedule for Artemis in 2026. And um, I think that SpaceX will be doing very, very well to do that test anytime in 2025. Anyway, that's kind of the next big step, and then you can build up to an uncrewed lunar landing, and then you eventually get to a crewed lunar landing. But I think a realistic time frame would be a no earlier than date of 2028.
Okay.
And
Thank
oh,
you.
by the way, none of the other vehicles, there's no other lunar lander. Even if Congress today were to throw 10 billion at Lockheed or Boeing or somebody to build a traditional Apollo-like lunar lander, which is entirely expendable, it would take them 7 to 10 years to deliver that. So there's Starship is your best bet, even if it's complicated and huge at this point.
Okay. Um, other Justin, I'm sorry to call you that. Justin G says, EU's access to space seems to be in a bad way. Where do you see their future headed? And then Justin jokingly adds, China joint ventures?
No, I think Europe at one time was looking toward working with China. At one time, Samantha Cristoforetti and another astronaut, I forget his name, spent time in China. Were learning Chinese language, and possibly we're going to fly to the Chinese space station. That has really been pulled back as tensions between the West and China have deteriorated a little bit. Europe's in an interesting position. They've got to decide where they really want their center of expertise to be. Um, and I think things that they should be doing are investing in their commercial space industry, which they're finally starting to do a little bit, and really trying to figure out where they want to be in the 2030s and skate toward that puck. Is that a center of excellence for planetary exploration with robotic probes? Is that, or what role do they want to play with human spaceflight? And I think their current approach, which is trying to do everything, the Joseph Hochbacher, who's the leader of the European Space Agency, I like him a lot, actually. But he's been really pushing for them to develop a human spaceflight capability. And I just don't see why they would do that because they don't have anywhere for their astronauts to go that wouldn't be a US destination, and that would consume so much of their available budget. So I think Europe really needs to figure out what they want to do and really focus on that as a center of excellence. They can't afford to do everything with their existing budget, or even if they were to double it.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to try to do a couple quick ones. Ethan asks, is there anything in Reentry that mentions anything outside of SpaceX like Rocket Lab, ULA, or Blue Origin?
Yes, at the end of the book, the last chapter, I talk about how SpaceX is rise has looked from several of those companies, including United Launch Alliance, Blue Origin, Russia, and Arianespace in Europe. Um, but the book is primarily about SpaceX. So other companies are in there from time to time, but sort of as tangential elements of the story.
Okay. From Peter, the everyday astronaut Tim Dodd's recent tour around Blue Origin was very impressive, but how far behind SpaceX do you think they really are?
They're way behind, just in the sense that it took SpaceX 10 years, um, really to go from the debut launch of the Falcon 9 to getting a regular cadence of reuse and really upping its launch cadence. So, Blue Origin is talking about trying to launch 24 rockets next year, New Glenn rockets. Like, there's no way they're going to get to that kind of cadence. Um, However, they have made huge investments in facilities and development of the New Glenn rocket and lots of other cool things. I like Dave Limp. He's the new CEO. He's been there for about 10 months now. He came from Amazon, and he has really injected a sense of urgency into Blue Origin that we have not seen before. But they've got a lot of catching up to do with SpaceX. But they are the only company that has the funding to compete in a broad way like SpaceX is doing in terms of building rockets, in terms of, launching lots of satellites, in terms of potentially human spaceflight, in terms of lunar landers. So they're still the company that's full of potential that needs to deliver on it.
Okay. This from Alexander, because you just said cadence. Operationally, Falcon 9 has increased its launch cadence to by 60-fold to date, roughly 3 days between launches currently. What does the space exploration slash economy look like if Starship slash Super Heavy launches at that rate? And what does the world look like if Starship slash Super Heavy is launching 3 times a day?
See, we don't know. That's the great thing about this era is we're kind of on the edge of the kind of an unknowable future. The reality is that space access has never been low cost, frequent, or cheap. I said low cost and cheap, but it's never been cheap. It's never been frequent. And the other thing that Starship brings is this enormous payload fairing. You could almost fit my house inside of that thing. And so it's just everything you've ever sent before had to be as light as possible and as cramped up as possible. And Starship doesn't completely, but it really substantially reduces those constraints in ways we've never seen before. So I think once Starship becomes operational, we'll sort of see that creativity really starting to flow.
Okay. Um, from Cameron, do you think we will get to a point where there are multiple companies or countries with a Starship style system?
I know China is doing some work on this, but it's going to be 10 or 15 years, I think, before their government gets to that point. They're building initially for their lunar program, they're building quite traditional like type rockets.
Okay. From Gail, has NASA been losing its top engineers?
Yes, it's a serious problem for NASA. Here in Houston, um, at Johnson Space Center, I apologize, my dogs are a little excited if you can hear that.
We can
Um,
barely hear it.
okay. So at Johnson Space Center, they're losing engineers to the local space industry. In Florida at Kennedy Space Center, their Blue Origin has been hiring talent left and right. And the reality is, for young and talented engineers, you can go to the private sector and make more money. Um, and oftentimes, these are more attractive positions because you're building stuff that's likely to fly sooner. And so, yes, NASA has had a real challenge. Their workforce tends to be older than the private space industry. And so there was actually just recently a report that came out about trying to shore up the workforce to make it younger and to retain their better talent. It's a serious problem for the space agency.
Yeah. I'm just going to do a couple more and then we're going to wrap because I want to keep this under an hour. From Murray, how do you view the sustainability, both political and funding, support of Artemis after the first couple of missions?
It depends on how NASA executes it. If they go to the moon a couple times and then, don't have anything else ready to go in terms of like habitats, longer missions, then I think it goes away. However, if they do execute on their current plan, and if China does really start to build up lunar infrastructure too, that is going to be an ongoing impetus to fund it. So politically, I believe Artemis is in a really great spot. There's lots of support for the program, but NASA and its contractors just have to go out and execute. And most of the programs are behind schedule. And so it's really, if Artemis is to be a success, it's on NASA and SpaceX, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop, United Launch Alliance, all these other different companies to execute, and Blue Origin to come along so that they can deliver.
Excellent. And this one I'm going to use as the last question from the group, and then I've got mine. This is from Jay. Who are writers that have influenced you and or that you are a fan of?
Um, great question. In terms of the space industry, um, there have been lots of really great journalists that have come before me, but like in terms of science journalism, like when I was younger, I really looked up to Bill Broad at the New York Times. Um, he was excellent. A little bit later, I was very inspired by Ashley Vance, who wrote Elon Musk biography in 2014. And what was striking about that book is just how much he was able to get at a time when, Elon didn't want someone writing about him. And it just really was kind of an eye-opening work. So those are kind of in terms of my professional industry, those are two people who I've looked up to as kind of role models.
So in terms of what we discussed right before we came online, like what, let me phrase it differently. Given everything that's on your plate professionally and as well as, family, all those kinds of things, do you have time to read? And what do
Yes.
you read?
So I read lots of different things, but two of my favorite genres are um, science fiction slash fantasy and then history.
Okay.
S- So like um, after I read the Game of Thrones series, I was like trying to find something else that was kind of in that genre that was going to be as good. Um, and I stumbled upon a British author named Joe Abercrombie, and he wrote a 9-part series um, called the First Law trilogy. It starts with the First Law trilogy, and then there's 6 other books, and those are fantastic fantasy realism books. Just the characters in those books are amazing, and so anyone who wants that, those are probably the best. I would say those are the best fantasy novels I've read ever. Um,
That
and
is of
then
good to know.
and then history. I've been working my way through Marlborough, His Life and Times by Winston Churchill, and that's a 4-part series, several thousand pages written in fairly stilted British prose. But Churchill is an incredible writer, and
Really?
oh God, yes, he's amazing. And he was started out as a journalist, and so I really admire him from the standpoint of he's a writer, a historian who also, was the single person who really saved the world from Nazism for about a year there in 1940, 1941. Um, and basically was the last, you know, European ruler standing in the way of Hitler's total domination before the United States came in and Russia ultimately came in against Germany, of course, because they'd signed a pact with Hitler initially that left Churchill standing. Anyway, marvelous historian and writer, and Marlborough was this great general, a couple hundred years earlier when Great Britain was trying to fight back France and popery, and Churchill's like his, I don't know, tenth generation ancestor. Marlborough's name was John Churchill. Anyway, it's fascinating to have Churchill writing about his ancestor, and just it's illuminating prose, but you've got to be on kind of on your A game to follow along because it's
That
anyway.
I had no idea. That's fascinating. I think I know what someone in my house is getting for Christmas. I'm just going to throw one back at you that I just read and thought it was fantastic. It's modern history, but it's called The Siege. And
Hmm.
it is about the 6-day siege of the Iranian embassy in London in 1980. I
That
had
sounds
no idea.
fascinating.
I had
I
no idea it had happened.
Right, yeah, because there was the whole
Right.
America was all distracted with what was happening with
And
the
and
hostages.
so was Britain, and so was like the entire British intelligence. They assumed it was payback, and it was not. It was a group of Iranian Arab students who were protesting the treatment of Arabs versus Persians in Iran.
Hmm.
It reads like a thriller. Like I was listening to it and I did not want to get out of the car. It
Those are
was
the best books.
yes, it was fantastic. So all y'all, Caroline, my colleague behind the scenes, have been writing down all the books. We will send you a list of them so you can use Eric's recommendations and my one if you're interested. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you for supporting Blue Willow and Eric. Um, and Eric, I know I say it to you all the time, but like we're so eternally grateful to you for your science writing and for your weather reporting. The world is a better place because you are in it.
Well, that's very, very kind, Kathy. Thank you so much.
You are so welcome. I had the best time. I learned a lot. Everybody, thanks for your great questions. Thanks for participating. And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Great. Thank you.
Have a good night. Bye bye.